In my last video, I told you about how Huawei, one of China's largest tech companies, released the Mate 60 Pro mobile phone, which came as somewhat of a shock to many, as it used many Chinese-developed components, especially semiconductors, which US sanctions were meant to stop China producing, or so think US politicians. If you've not seen that video, I'll link it up here and also leave a link in the video description. Something that I failed to mention in that video was the fact that the phone was launched during the visit of Gina Raimondo, the US Secretary of Commerce, her department being responsible for imposing export controls on goods, software and technology. I can't help feel it was a slap in the face for the USA, and reminds me of a similar incident back in 2011 when Robert M. Gates, the then Secretary of Defense, visiting China, and China unveiled the J-20 fighter plane. Gates, of course, downplayed the significance of the J-20, saying that it was still in the early stages of development and that it was not clear how effective it would be. The unveiling of the J-20 was a sign of China's growing military and technical capability and its ambitions to become a major player in the global aerospace industry. However, in this video, I want to explore the reaction from industry experts in the USA, and then later in the video I'll give you my analysis on why I think the US technology sanctions on China will eventually fail and ultimately do more harm to the US semiconductor industry. From what I have observed since the launch of Huawei's handset, there is little coverage in the mainstream Western media. It seems most of the coverage has been from tech publications and websites. The South China Morning Post also covered the story, but I want to look at this article in the Washington Post, as this publication is more reflective of the mood in the US. The article opens with the title, "New phone sparks worry China has found a way around US tech limits," and in its opening paragraph says, "It was no normal gadget, and its launch has sparked hush concern in Washington that US sanctions have failed to prevent China from making a key technological advance. Such development would seem to fulfill warnings from US chip makers that sanctions wouldn't stop China, but would spur it to redouble efforts to build alternatives to US technology." And that's exactly what the sanctions are indeed doing. US politicians simply do not understand the mindset of Chinese people. When backed into a corner, they will double down and do what is required. The article then goes on to quote a number of experts in the field. Firstly, Paul Triolo, technology policy lead at the Washington-based business consulting firm Stonebridge Group, called the new phone a major blow to all of Huawei's former technology suppliers, mostly US companies. The article went on to say, US sanctions were intended to slow China's progress in emerging fields like artificial intelligence and big data by cutting off its ability to buy or build advanced semiconductors, which are the brains of these systems. The unveiling of a domestically produced 7nm chip suggests that that has not happened. And Chris Miller, a professor at Tufts University and author of the book Chip Wars, was quoted as saying, "This shows that Chinese companies like Huawei still have plenty of capability to innovate," and added, "I think it will also probably intensify debate in Washington on whether restrictions are to be tightened." Paul Triolo also thinks it will cause tightening of sanctions, saying, "This development will also certainly prompt much stronger calls for further tightening of export control licensing for US suppliers of Huawei who continue to be able to ship commodity semiconductors that are not used for 5G applications." But would imposing further sanctions stop China's technology development or just cause more harm to semiconductor companies in the US and its allies, Japan, Korea, Taiwan and the Netherlands. Let's have a look at some historical context. The United States developed the Global Positioning System, GPS, in the 1970s, and it became fully operational in the 1990s. The United States initially denied the Soviet Union access to GPS technology. This was due to Cold War tensions and concerns that the Soviets could use GPS for military purposes. The Soviet Union responded to the US denial of GPS access by developing its own GNSS system, GLONASS, which was first launched in 1982. China also started development of its own system, known as Beidou, in the 1990s. The first Beidou satellites were launched in 2000, providing limited coverage only over China. In 2003, China joined the Galileo satellite navigation project, a European initiative. However, China later withdrew from Galileo to focus efforts on expanding Beidou. By 2012, China had expanded Beidou to provide regional coverage over Asia Pacific, and in 2018, Beidou 3 was completed, giving full global coverage on par with GPS and GLONASS. China continues upgrading and expanding Beidou satellites, aiming to provide more precise positioning and navigation services than GPS or GLONASS. The International Space Station, ISS, has been a symbol of international cooperation in space since the first components were launched into orbit in 1988. However, China has been excluded from any partition in the ISS due to opposition primarily from the United States. As a result, China developed its own independent human spaceflight program, culminating in the Tiangong space station launch in 2021. The origins of China's ISS exclusion trace back to the 1990s. Following the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States invited Russia to join the NASA-led ISS program in 1993. Other partners in the project included Japan, Canada, and members of the European Space Agency. However, out of security concerns, the US Congress passed legislation in 2011 banning NASA from bilateral cooperation with China on space. This effectively prohibited China from any role in the International Space Station. With no prospects of joining the ISS, China committed in 2016 to build its own space station called Tiangong, or Heavenly Palace. The core Tianhe module lifted off in April 2021, marking the start of an orbit assembly. This was followed by the launch of 2 additional modules in 2022, Wentian and Mengtian, completing the Tiangong station. In 2019, a major achievement for the Chinese space program, the landing of China's Chang'e 4 on the far side of the moon. It is the first time that a spacecraft from any country has landed on the far side of the moon. The mission is also the first to conduct scientific experiments on this part of the moon's surface. As you can see from the historical examples of the GPS system and the International Space Station, the US blocking other countries for technology just pushes those countries to develop their own competing technology. And semiconductors is no different. Now let me share with you why I think the US sanctions will not stop China's development. It may slow them down, but it will not stop their progress. And after all, China play the long game. There are many voices in the US that oppose current and further sanctions on China, arguing that more harm will be caused to US companies. 2 of those voices are Jensen Huang, CEO of Nvidia, and Pat Gelsinger, CEO of Intel, 2 men who should know what they are talking about. Jensen Huang recently said, "The US government needs to find a way to work with China on shared interests, while also taking steps to protect our own technology. Sanctions are not the answer." And Pat Gelsinger of Intel said, "The US government needs to be careful about imposing sanctions on China. Sanctions can backfire and hurt US companies more than they hurt Chinese companies." Recently, these 2 CEOs were part of a delegation that had a meeting with the Biden administration in Washington to express their concerns that the sanctions are doing long-term harm to the US technology industry. There are a number of ways in which this will affect the market. Increased competition. China's semiconductor industry is becoming more competitive, and more Chinese companies are investing in chip design and manufacturing. This will put pressure on US semiconductor companies to lower their prices. Loss of market share. China is a major consumer of semiconductors, and its domestic semiconductor industry is growing rapidly. This means that the US semiconductor companies could lose market share in China to Chinese companies. Increased costs. The US semiconductor industry relies on China for many of its raw materials and components. If China restricts the export of these materials or components, it could drive up costs for US semiconductor companies. Personally, I think it's foolish that the US thinks its sanctions will stop China's technological advance. After all, the development of semiconductors is physics, chemistry and maths, coupled with advanced manufacturing and material science, and China has a huge advantage here. For example, China graduates significantly more students in STEM fields than the USA. In 2022, China graduated over 6 million students in STEM subjects, compared with only 669,000 in the USA. And remember, 90,000 of the US total were Chinese citizens. This large number of STEM graduates gives China a significant advantage in terms of the talent pool available to its technology industry. There is also a significant number of Chinese American scientists and academics leaving the USA due to increased political polarization and anti-China sentiment. The US political climate has become increasingly polarized in recent years, and this has created a hostile environment for many Chinese Americans. As Chinese Americans play a significant role in semiconductor research, this is also a huge problem for the US tech industry. However, I'm planning to cover this soon in a future video, so stay tuned. There's a saying in China, the rough English translation is, lift a rock only to drop it on your own feet. And this is exactly what I think the USA are doing with their China tech sanctions. If you've made it this far in the video, I'd like to say a big thank you for spending your time with me today. I do hope you liked the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And if you like the channel in general, please consider hitting that subscribe button. However, as always, for now, take care.